Hello there. Welcome to Esquire Neighbourhood. My name is Wayne Cheong, and I'm the Deputy Editor for Esquire Singapore. Today, we are going to be interviewing Neil Humphreys. He is our monthly columnist for the magazine, and he's also a writer. Yes, a job that still pays. Neil Humphreys has written for the newspaper, Straits Times. He has written several books. He's an eco-warrior. As much of a warrior as he could be. He has written the series of Inspector Lowe, Marina Bay Sins, and his latest book, Bloody Foreigners, which is now out in the UK and in Singapore, and is doing great right over there. I can see product placement. I'd like to welcome Neil Humphreys to this. Hello, Neil.
Hello, Wayne. Thank you very much. What a lovely introduction. Almost all of it was true.
Which one is not true?
Oh, it's all true. I'm kidding. It's all true. Thank you very much. Very kind.
Because people known you as a satirist and someone who's always like big into sports and whatnot. For the crime genre, was it something always that you're leaning towards in your career?
A bit of everything, a bit of serendipity, a bit of luck, a bit of unique circumstances. What had happened was as you rightly mentioned, I'd written several books about Singapore, living in Singapore, social commentary, humor, that kind of thing. And I was very fortunate. They sold rather well. And of course, the publisher, once you've got the so-called formula for Coca-Cola, they expect you just to keep producing Coca-Cola for the rest of your life, you know. And I didn't really have anything to say, especially as I wasn't living in Singapore at the time. After my third book came out, I moved to Australia briefly, but my books were still selling even in Singapore after I'd left. So the publisher said, all right, I'll never forget this. Let's just meet up. And this is interesting for any young writer. You never know where ideas will strike. My persistent publisher said, let's just meet up next time you're in Singapore. So we did, and we had a cup of tea in one of these crappy, you know, coffee places. I don't drink coffee, and it ended up lasting about 6 hours. That's not an exaggeration. We talked for about 6 hours, just talking rubbish, talking nonsense, and I kept saying, you know, I got nothing left to say on the non-fiction side because I don't live in Singapore. It would be preposterous, and me writing about Australia, a country I'd only been in for 5 minutes, wouldn't work. So then, as we often do, when you get together with friends, we started gossiping just about general stuff. And there was some stories about match fixing in the news. And I said, oh, if you want to know about match fixing, let me tell you about when I was a sports reporter for the Straits Times. I'll tell you the real story about match fixing. And then from there, we just started talking. And my publisher said, you do realize you've just outlined an entire book. I said, well, I can't write non-fiction for that. I would spend years and years in litigation and lawyers and this and that. I said, just write it as fiction then. And we'll put in one of those nice disclaimers at the beginning, you know, anything related to people, persons living or dead is pure coincidence and all that crap. And so I wrote Match Fixer, and that came out in about 2010-ish. And considering it was my first novel, first attempt, it's not perfect, but it was first attempt. It sold quite well because my name was relatively still well known in Singapore. And so for a fiction book, it sold like really high numbers in Singapore for a fiction book, especially one set in Singapore. They just don't sell in large numbers. And I had a character in that book, an incidental character, I might add, called Inspector Lowe, who wasn't in it much. He's not the main protagonist. He's not even the second, third, fourth lead. He's really a plot device, a plot twist, because I needed someone who could go undercover. And then near the end, there's this big ta-da. I was not an R-Bing. I was ta-da, an undercover CPIB inspector all along. And I like that character so much that I came back to him in Marina Bay Sins and gave him his own novel. And the rest is history.
For those who haven't read Match Fixer, don't let that twist deter you from actually reading the book. But was it always on your bucket list actually write something that's fiction?
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. Everybody's bucket list is to write fiction. And I think they're lying if they say otherwise. You get into it however which way you can. And so I was writing, you know, in my one room that I rented in Toa Payoh, Lorong 8 with my crazy landlady. I was writing fiction. None of it got published. None of it got made. When I moved to like a typical Singaporean, you know, when I moved to my 3-room flat in Toa Payoh, I was writing fiction, screenplays. None of it got published. And some of the, you know, any young writers listening, agents are cruel and commissioners are cruel. They say they're being cruel to be kind. Sometimes they're just bloody cruel. And I was writing this when I was 21, 22, 23. I was writing it before when I was 17, 18, 19. My wife, who's in the room next door, when she was my girlfriend back in England, it got to the ridiculous stage where she would leave, you wouldn't believe this, Wayne, she'd leave a notepad and a pen by her door, because when I was like 17, 18, I used to have to walk like a kilometer across this public park in East London to get to her. And every single time without fail, I'd have $1 million book idea or $1 million script idea, and I'd have to write it down the second I got to her house a kilometer away. So, and they were always fiction, always. And none of them have been made and none of them have been published. And some of the feedback I got from commissioners and agents was horrendous. You know, this is awful writing. This is that, this is cliche. This is, this is plagiarized. This is a Tarantino-esque ripoff. This is a Guy Ritchie-esque ripoff, whatever was around at the time. And it was so, you know, and people don't realize this sometimes. They see your book and they think, oh, it was a doddle. But I had so much rejection that unless you really believe this is what you want to do, you'll give up. And that's how you know, because anybody who got the kind of rejection I got would have given up. And then, so I kept going, all rejected. And then finally, I thought, well, all these stories that I'm encountering and having in Singapore that I'm telling people in coffee shops and schools and when I was a journalist at Straits Times, I seem to get a stronger reaction from them than all this crap fiction I was writing. So I thought, well, just put all them together and see what happens. And that's how my first Singaporean book came about. But then you don't scratch that itch. It doesn't go away. Even though I'm writing the Singapore books, at the back of my mind, it was always, well, this could be a gateway to fiction or to whatever. So it's a long answer, but it's a long career and lots of rejection along the way. I always wanted to write fiction, and I'm very surprised. I've not met too many writers who don't. Yeah.
Speaking of which, your first book, Notes from an Even Smaller Island.
Yes.
That was the first book that was published. That was about 20 years ago, yes? And that's
exactly 2001, yeah.
So is there a 20th anniversary of a reissue of the book coming out?
Yeah, it's extraordinary because I don't know how often this happens for a Singapore title. I've got Catherine Lim's box set on the shelf, so it happened to her, and Lee Kuan Yew is up there, so it happened to him. So I'm in good company, but generally speaking, Singapore local books don't generally get republished or special editions or whatever. But that book was bizarre because Notes from an Even Smaller Island, it came out, as you say, late November 2001. And it's not very well produced. My publisher won't like me for saying it. It was very cheap and cheerful. This is around the time of No Money, No Honey, Excuse Me, Are You an Actress? And all these kind of, Crows was another one about sex workers. I remember. So all these books were coming out and they were kind of lightweight, paperback, stack them high, sell them cheap, $9, $10, whatever.
Like pulps.
Pretty much, yeah. But that was the local scene back then, generally speaking, unless your name was Lee Kuan Yew and you got the heavy, weighty tome, or you wrote you see, it's fascinating, Wayne, because people often ask me, what is your secret? Why is it so successful? And I think sometimes you need that outsider's perspective, because I came into Singapore and like a very good, desperate, guy trying to assimilate into the local culture, I tried to find as many books as I could about Singapore, and there really wasn't that many. And what was fascinating about the Singaporean bookshelf then, it's changed now. You had this extraordinary spectrum on the shelf, where on the one hand, you had weighty tomes, Men in White, Lee Kuan Yew memoirs, the fall of Singapore, Japanese occupation, Raffles, all these weighty historical doorstep tomes, And then on the other end, you had books about this thin, The Adventures of an Air Steward, The Adventures of Sex Workers in Singapore, and like I said, No Money, No Honey, and they sold in large quantities. And for the younger readers, you had the ghost stories and midnight stories and all that. Very thin, very pulpy, sold in large numbers. But it was very much at the other end of the spectrum. But what there was this huge gap in the middle, huge gap that was not hopefully throwaway, dismissive, pulpy, was reasonably intelligent, reasonably insightful, sometimes humorous. But it was not as academic, I need a PhD or a degree in history to read it first kind of book. Massive gap in the bookshelf, which in other countries was filled by Bill Bryson, Helen Fielding, Nick Hornby, Tony Parsons, John Grisham, James Patterson, Lee Child, whatever your tastes are. It would be Bridget Jones, Jack Reacher, whatever. What we call in the industry airport thrillers, the books that basically keep the industry alive, which people forget. Jodie Picoult would be another example. So I would see, even in the 90s and the early 2000s, I would see Singaporeans buying all these books in huge numbers, huge numbers. They'll always be the top 10 bestsellers at Keynote, but they're about America, or they're about Britain, or they're about Australia. And I found it bizarre. You're reading these travel logs, these funny, humorous travel logs that Bill Bryson is writing about Australia or the US or the UK. Why is no one writing them about Singapore? And you're reading these funny books about coming of age written by Nick Hornby or Helen Fielding, about a boy, Fever Pitch, High Fidelity, all big sellers in Singapore at that time. Man and Boy, Tony Parsons, huge sellers. Why are you not writing these books about Singapore? The only one I could think of that came anywhere close, that tapped into the zeitgeist, was Adrian Tan's teenage textbook, which was close to what I read growing up. Adrian Mole, The Secret Diary of Adrian Mole, age 30. That's a coming of age book. That's a rites of passage book. And shock horror, the Diary of a Teenage, the teenage textbook in Singapore, sold tens of thousands of copies, and was turned into a TV series. And it's like, it's not rocket science. Adrian was filling that huge gap in the middle of the Singaporean bookshelf that wasn't Lee Kuan Yew from third world to first world. And it wasn't, the Diary of a Sex Worker. There is a hell of a story to tell in the middle that wasn't being told. And that's all I did, really. That's all I did. I plugged a bit of a gap. And now, I'm not saying I was the only one, but I was one of the few. And now, thankfully, that's changed. My publisher, Epigram, Ethos, they're really plugging that gap now, which is great. But in the 90s, man, if you didn't want to read about the PAP and you didn't want to read about sex workers in Geylang, you were pretty stuffed for things to read on a Singaporean bookshelf in the 90s.
For the reissue of stories from an even smaller island, well, are there any additional updates to the articles that you wrote back then? Because I think
yeah, it's a good point. I didn't really answer your question, did I? I just said why it got published. So to bring it up, so that was why the book did so well, essentially, was because it kept going. I mean, I compare it to a title of a Friends episode, the one about Ross this, the one about Joey that. That's the name of the titles. Well, my book was a bit similar. It wasn't a massive success initially, because it went into bestsellers and then it faded. But then what happened was, through word of mouth, this weird thing started to happen, and people would say things like, have you read the one about the void deck funeral? Have you read the one about expats? Have you read the one about gays? Have you read the one about foreign workers? And they're talking about my book, and they're remembering specific anecdotes. So it spread and spread and spread and spread. And it had an extraordinary shelf life. So much so that even when I left Singapore 10 years later, it was still selling. It was still on the bestseller list. So fast forward 20 years, and we thought, to commemorate that weird, freaky thing that happened, we'll update it. And Wayne, I was very apprehensive, because nobody wants to go back 20 years. Nobody. 20 years is a long time. You know, I wrote that book when I was 23, 24. I mean, that's ridiculous. And now I'm 46, and I didn't want to go back. But what had happened was, 2 years ago, similar thing, I was asked to do audiobooks for Storytel for the first time. So I had to read it again, to read it myself for the audiobook. I really didn't want to do it. And I was behaving a bit, you know, Howlien Atas author. You know, I was a bit, can we not get like Adrian Pung to do it instead? Can we not get, you know, Chin Han to read it or something? And it wasn't that I was being arrogant. I didn't want to read it. I just didn't want to read it.
Could you explain to the audience, what is it about reading your older works that troubles you?
Well, it can be like taking a big shit. You know, at the time, it's very relieving. You know, it's very, that felt good. You know, you're empty. There's a release. You're happy. It's gone. But no one wants to talk about their shits from 20 years ago. And getting to the point, that's the fundamental question that all our authors will ask about previous works. What if it's shit? What if I go back and I strip away all the hype and the hoopla and the book sales and the this and the that? What if it's shit? Especially if it's the book that so-called launched your career. So I go back and read it. And everything that I was right and I was wrong, Wayne. Of course I was right, in the sense that the writing is raw and abrasive and sometimes simplistic and sometimes naive. I expected most of that. And sometimes a bit clunky. And sometimes you can tell I'm a 23-year-old, 24-year-old working class guy with a big chip on my shoulder, trying to write like a 45-year-old middle-aged academic. And the best parts of the book is when I just say, F it. This is me. This is who I am at 23. This is how I write. Like it or lump it. And those are the best bits. The bits that really hold up today, which I'm really proud of, even now, is that, yes, the writing is raw, simplistic, but there's an honesty and a visceral element to the writing that I'm not even sure I could recapture now. So could I write a technically better book now? Of course. I mean, when you read it, the introduction and the epilogue literally sound like my updated parts, literally sound like they've been written by somebody else, because they've been written by Neil Humphreys at 46, not Neil Humphreys at 24. They're much better written. They're much more insightful. But what I admire about the kid, and he was a kid really, who wrote the first book, was, to use like an Italian expression, the cojones on this boy, the balls of this kid. Who the hell did he think he was? I'm laughing out loud reading that this kid is 24 years old and he's an expert on Singapore. At that time, I had been in Singapore for 4 years, and I'm writing a book that ended up becoming one of the best-selling books for 10 years, the next 10 years. And that's extraordinary. And Wayne, I'm just going to say it. I don't get enough credit, even now, because I'm like, it's like dropping anybody, you know, drop a Singaporean into London. And then 4 years later, he's writing a book about London, about the quirks and the foibles of Londoners. And he's doing it at the age of 24. And it becomes a national bestseller. And all the Londoners read it and go, wow, he's really tapped into something there. I can't believe I had the balls to do that at 24. So those are the bits I like the most. The honesty, the visceral writing from the gut element. And the bit that I try and pass on to all young writers is, and I was probably guilty of this later on, don't try and write, I'm saying this to other young writers, don't try and write like Neil Humphreys. Don't try and write like, you know, Catherine Lim or Alfian Sa'ad or anybody else. Don't, because it won't work. It will fail miserably. Just write like you. Now that sounds really cliche, but it happens to be true. And if there's something I was slightly guilty of later in some of my, I probably shouldn't say this, but in the next couple of books, is that you start second guessing yourself. It's human nature. It's called in rock business the second album syndrome. You know, you wrote the first album from the gut in your parents' basement or in your bedroom, you know, and then you get famous and successful, and then artists are constantly trying, well, what was it that made, you know, Oasis Definitely Maybe, or Nirvana's Nevermind, or whatever, you know, how do we recapture? Well, you can't. It's lightning in a bottle. You can't, but you keep trying. So I was guilty of trying to write like Neil Humphreys a bit afterwards when I should have just wrote. Does that make sense? You start second guessing your writing. And that's the best thing about the first book, is that it's instinctive, it's raw, it's honest, it's visceral, it's from the gut. And everybody's first book, everybody's first album, everybody's first should be like that. I mean, and of course, you know, Paul McCartney can technically write a better song today than he could when he wrote A Hard Day's Night.
Oh.
But he can't write A Hard Day's Night now. And that's it. That's just life. And it makes artists and authors and writers want to blow their brains out sometimes, because it's so, why can't I just do that again? You can't.
What is your process like? I mean, do you sit down, do you set aside hours a day just to sit down and just churn out words?
Yeah. I'm a slow starter. I get up sort of like about 8 o'clock, 7:30, 8 o'clock. I always have tea. I wake up, I watch the news and have a bit of breakfast. And it may look like I'm being lazy, and I'll probably start, if it's writing for me, like books, then it'll probably kick in at around 11 plus. If it's like regular work, column work, I might do that a bit earlier, because for me, everyone's different. I'm looking for that sweet spot, and it only lasts about 1 or 2 hours, where it sounds like such a torturous experience, and you know this yourself, and it actually is a torturous experience, because you're looking for the sweet spot where it just rolls, it just writes itself. And it doesn't happen all the time. It doesn't even happen every day, but it certainly doesn't happen when you've just woken up. So it's usually for me around, I can be quite specific. It's usually around the areas about 11 to 3, which is why I have very erratic eating habits, because I don't want to stop and eat when it's flowing, when it's happening. And that period will always be the best. The second you go away, for me, even if it's for 20 minutes, half an hour, have a sandwich, come back, it's not quite the same. And the analogy I always use with students is a simple analogy, but once the writing flows and you think it's flowing, never stop. It doesn't matter if you're writing for 6 hours or 6 minutes, never stop, because the train is on the track and it's hurtling towards the destination. And you don't necessarily know. I always say, I don't necessarily know how it's going to get there. I know where my station is. I know where this chapter has to end, because I have it roughly mapped out in bullet point form, you know, A, B, C, D. I roughly know where Inspector Lowe needs to be by the end of the chapter. I know the station I'm heading to. I have absolutely no idea in the writing where the detours are going to come, left, right, whatever. That's the best part. Do not stop. Do not stop until you reach the destination. Now that happens, Wayne, even when I know the writing's not great in real time. I know it's not, but I still keep going. That's what editing is for. You keep going, you keep going, you keep going. You do not stop, because my obsession, my paranoia, and it's why my door is constantly locked and I drive my wife and daughter mad, is because, and this has happened many times, I'm sure it has to you, If I'm in the flow and I'm going and I'm on that track and I get interrupted with a phone call or this or that, mid-paragraph or mid-sentence, the odds of me getting back on the same track, it's like a multiverse, you know, these timelines in Marvel, you know, it's like being an episode of Loki, you know, the odds of me getting on the same track at the same time to get to the same destination are 1,000,000 to 1. And I'm a paranoid about that. Now, you could argue I could come back and get onto a better track, but I don't know. For me, if I'm writing, I cannot be interrupted at all. I have to keep going. I have to work in silence, and I do not stop at all until I've reached where I need to be. Yeah, it could take 1 hour, it could take 4 hours, whatever, but I do not stop. You know.
For your Inspector Low series, do you actually have future books all mapped out? Like
No. I'm not J.K. Rowling, and honestly, most writers don't. And if they say they do, it could literally be along the lines of, like, I mean, this one, for example, my kids' books. You know, I had an idea for 3. This is the Princess Incognito series for middle grade readers. I had a rough idea for 3 because everything, especially children's books, they like it in trilogies. And then when they started to sell well, okay, I thought I have bullet points for 4, 5, and 6, and that's it. I'll wrap it up at 6. I am going to wrap it up at 6. The next one comes out next year. And but it's really only bullet points. And for Inspector Low, something like Inspector Low, absolutely not, because you could go crazy with that, in my view, you know, because I don't know if they're going to sell. I don't know if they're going to be, I don't even know if they're going to be published. And I am not one of these arty-farty, oh, I just write for me. Well, then don't try and get a publisher then. You know who says that? Failed writers say that, right? Because nobody writes for me. The definition of the written word is it should be read by other people. That's the whole purpose of being a writer, is for people to read your work. And if you don't want it to be read by others, then don't seek a publisher. Just self-publish it, make it gold embossed, and just give it to your loved ones. So I don't plan that far ahead, because if I planned out 5 or 6 books and the first book was, no, it's the biggest pile of crap I've ever read, well, what a waste of time that was. You know, I've only got so many hours in the day. I haven't got time to plan out 6 books that may or may not get published. So I very much go book to book, book to book. And I'm just starting to sketch out one now. And it's I'll even show you. There you go. You won't be able to read it. But so it's just bullet points. But it even says, look, there's the word epilogue. So it's about 5 pages sketched out, and it will roughly be about 30 or 40 bullet points, which is 30 or 40 chapters. So I'm almost, that's quite detailed already, like 1 line per chapter. With a kind of book like a procedural, even though it's not really procedural, but a psychological crime thriller, you have to have at least I have to have a rough bullet point guide. You can't wing it. You know, you can't wing a crime thriller, because you're juggling you're spinning too many plates. It'll just fall apart. You have to know where you're going and where it's going to end. Yeah, you have to, yeah.
What is the hardest aspect of writing the book, especially for the Inspector Low series? Is it the characterization or the research?
That's easy. It's the beginning. It's starting. It's terrifying. And I've just started this book, and I've only written the prologue. And as usual, I'm not happy with it. But at least it's written now. And that is, again, I'm using the same analogy. It's like being constipated for ages and ages and ages, and then you finally go, and it's okay after that. That's the hardest part for all of my books. And it's crippling. It's crippling mentally, because even my wife is like, Jesus Christ, Neil, you've done this 25 times now. Do you have to go through this shit every time? But part of me thinks, yes, I wish she was right. But part of me also thinks there's massive imposter syndrome. You know, I think if you come from my background, I'm not privileged with that innate self-confidence that kids have. You know, in our line of work, my friend, we've met a lot of trust fund babies, and I envy their confidence. I do. They walk into a room like they own it. You know, I'm going to set up a bar with daddy's money. I don't care if it fails or succeeds. It's daddy's money. And they've got this confidence, this aura, this charisma that comes with going to a really good school and having good money background and blah, blah, blah. I just don't have that. So even after 25 books, there's still a crippling, not crippling's a bit too strong a word, but a real psychological barrier that I have to cross every time. The biggest one, of course, every writer has this: what if it's not as good as the last one? And you can't, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? You know, is it Joseph Heller? I think it's Joseph Heller who wrote Catch 22. I think, yeah, right? His famous line that I try and remember so I don't go insane is that, you know, a journalist once asked him, how does it feel that you've never wrote another book as good as Catch 22? Which is a stupid thing to ask any writer, but it's not it's not an uncommon question. How do you feel about never writing a book as good as Catch 22? And his answer was brilliant. He said, yeah, okay, but nobody else has either. So, you know, that's the only way to stop yourself going insane. I don't know if this book will be as good as Bloody Foreigners. I doubt it, which is a terrible thing to say, but certain books, you know, in the moment, you know, you've captured a moment, a zeitgeisty moment, and everyone's chasing it. I knew that when I wrote Bloody Foreigners, it had to come out now. Its themes are pertinent now. Its issues are pertinent now. I knew it. I was obsessed with it. In this post-Brexit world, rising nativism, rising xenophobia, rising rich-poor divide, racial privilege, it's all in that book. And I knew it had to come out now. And these issues are playing out across the world, including Singapore, in smaller, you know, in the margins, but still happening. You're seeing it now with the whole, the Indian situation. They're copying it at the moment. Used to be Angmos, then it was Filipinos, then it was PRCs, now it's Indians. But you see these racial tensions, these social tensions playing out. So I knew that Bloody Foreigners was capturing something. And sometimes, Wayne, that's what it is. It's luck. You write the book, and how good it is technically is far less important than if it captures a moment, a zeitgeist. And you cannot legislate for that. I mean, the obvious example would be Harry Potter. If Harry Potter comes out 5 years after, no way is J.K. Rowling a billionaire. That's not because of the quality of the books. That's because Harry Potter came out just before digital media, just before YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and everything to follow. If it comes out 5 years later, no. So you need these little moments. I'm always irritating my daughter because she says One Direction is the best band in the history of music, you know, and the reason I said no, they were the first social media band. What does that mean? Well, it means that they used Twitter. They were the first Twitter band. They come out in about 2010, just when Twitter happened. So One Direction exploded across the planet because of Twitter. They were lucky. Oh, but that's the truth. That's the truth. You go through history, that's the truth. The Beatles were the first transatlantic band when they could fly from country to country quite quickly. So they could fly around, you know. Every band has a moment, you know. Elvis was the first TV rock star, and so on and so on. So you have to capture a moment, and sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. And I have to deal with all of that psychologically every time I write something. Yeah.
How are you with social media?
I mean, I use it to promote my books and that, but I don't really use it for anything else anymore.
I mean, because you're using social media to promote your books, but you also promoted your causes or your beliefs. I mean, is the platform a good thing for writers to have?
Wow, that is a really good question, Wayne. There was a tipping point for me with social media because I used to be relatively active on it. You know, I'd post silly little notes and funny things and share stories and comment. But it was a real, I remember it, I may have written about it for Esquire. I think I did. But I remember what it was. Right. So at the height of COVID, Singapore released the, I still don't know the name, the tokens, you know, that you wear around your neck. The track and trace tokens, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if this was during or after the phone app, but they released those. Me being a techie, Luddite, I didn't even know what they were, but I happened to be passing the Sengkang CC, right? And I saw there was hardly any queue. I was with my wife and daughter, and my wife said, "Oh, those are those things we have to have, you know, the track and trace tokeny things." So, okay, fine. We go, show the IC. It takes 30 seconds. We get it. They said to me, just keep it in your bag, which I do. Wherever you go, we know where it is. And if there's a case, we'll alert you. Fantastic. I thought, what's not to like? So it would have been a pretty crappy week, COVID-wise, depressing. So I thought, right, I write a nice uplifting message on Facebook saying, you know, for all of the issues we've got, right? If you compare what Singapore is doing then to the rest of the world, we're groundbreaking, you know, we're gold standard. People can't even work out whether they lock down, not lock down, wear masks, not wear masks. And we've already got this fantastic tech that if there's a case in a mall that I visit, bang, I'll get contacted straight away. They'll tell me, fantastic. You know, we don't get everything right, but what we have done during COVID so far, we should all be proud and blah, blah, blah. And yeah, lots of people said, yeah, great, terrific, blah, blah, blah. But then I started to get the anti-government loons, you know, and it was a genuinely innocuous, positive post. There was no political subtext whatsoever. I was just trying to say something nice on a Saturday afternoon, you know. Oh, you've been brainwashed, Ungmore, you know, you've been here too long, you're a government stooge, you're a lackey, you know, this is George Orwell, so that, you know, they can follow us everywhere. It's 1984, it's government surveillance, it's this and that. Now they know what you're doing, wherever you're doing it, blah, 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 you naive fool, etc. Firstly, do you think I'm effing stupid? You have probably typed this message on a phone that knows where you are, what you shop, what you eat, where you live, what you do. You give your data willingly to Facebook, to Apple, to Amazon, to bloody Starbucks, to Grab, to Deliveroo every single day. I don't, because A, I'm a Luddite, and B, I just try not to give my data to anybody. So that's the biggest irony of all. I actually don't give my name and address and details to the world and his wife. But the irony, if you live in 2021 and you don't think big companies don't know what you're doing, where you're doing it, and how you're doing it, if you don't think that, then I don't know where you've been. Google Cambridge Analytica, Google data hacking, Google algorithms, and come back to me. But it was more about, you know what? I'm done. We have really reached a stage now where if I write on Facebook, blue, someone will go, screw you, red, right? We're just going to argue for the sake of arguing. We've just got to get angry for the sake of getting angry. It's become so binary. So the lack of nuance, the lack of, and it's not everybody, but, and the point is, it got to the, life is just too short, because I would go away from that Facebook post thinking, oh, now everybody thinks I'm a government lackey, you know, they think I'm a stooge, they think I've been paid, you know, this is a paid post brought to you by Ministry of Home Affairs or whatever, you know, they're going to think, why am I worrying about this shit? Why? It's not important. So since then, and literally since that day, actually, I only really post if I've got a new book coming out, like it, don't like it, fine. If I've got an event, like it, don't like it, fine. If if there's something I'm doing with Jane Goodall or Acres or this or that, something about the environment, I'll post it, fine. I used to share Guardian stories about climate change or the loss of biodiversity, which you would think, right? Do you want the planet to die? Hands up. No one? Okay, good. We're fine. We all agree. We all want the planet not to end up as a piece of charcoal in 10 years, 50 years. We all agree? Fine. You put up a Guardian piece, you will get people say, the whataboutery, but what about, and what about, and what about, I can't even put up a story about why we must save humanity without people saying, So yeah, so I don't use it that much. And also, if you look at news feeds, your own news feed, and sometimes I get caught, you can just, and you just think, I should be doing something else. I should be cycling or something. I should be doing something else, because you'll get too depressed. And it's not always an accurate reflection of society anyway. It's the echo chambers, it's the screamers and the shouters. It's pro-government, it's anti-government, it's pro this, it's anti that. No, I don't know what you think, but yeah, life's too short.
Is your mental well-being now better for it?
Oh yeah, God yeah. And I still go in and out. Like occasionally I'll read something that I genuinely want to read. It'll pop up, and of course the algorithm goes to work, and then I'm in the rabbit hole. But absolutely, my mental health is better. And plus, you've got that AI clone running it, Zuckerberg, who is not human. It's clearly obvious to me. He's got that Android thing going on. He looks like he was spawned by a Stepford wife. He looks like he was in that Spielberg Kubrick movie, AI. He's that kid, Haley Joel Osment, grown up. He's got the palest face I've ever seen. That tells me straight away he's a mannequin, right? And he came out last week with the whole fight. He's a terrifying presence. I haven't met him, obviously, but I've never come across a guy who is one of the most wealthiest people on the planet. And he's utterly like, hello, Mark, hello, Mark, hello. You are a billionaire. I mean, I am not a materialistic person, but there's part of me that wants to go, Mark, just take a year off, buy a yacht, do the cliched things that rich people do. Go climb Everest or something. Go send your phallic symbol to the edge of space, like the rest of them. The Kármán line. Go take your phallic symbol with William Shatner above the Kármán line and then come back again. And I don't know, but just lose that android emotionless thing that absolutely terrifies me, because the power and control you have over the rest of the planet, and you're still sort of, hello, Mark, scares the shit out of me, if I'm being honest.
I know we talked about this before, but just to let the audience know, we did touch on the topic on if you were to be the writer that you are today, had you not moved out of the UK, because you started out as a speech and drama teacher. But was this always something that's encoded into your DNA to be a writer, or do you feel like did you need to be displaced to actually do that?
It's a good question. And I sound like Lee Kuan Yew sometimes when he says, would your son have been prime minister if he wasn't your son? And Lee Kuan Yew always gave the same answer. If he wasn't my son, he'd have been prime minister even earlier, that kind of thing. Well, I used a similar thing. You're only a published author because you're an Ang Mo in Singapore. And I say, no, if I'd have stayed in England, I'd have been a published author even earlier. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but it's, an editor a while back. Talk about the worst thing you can say to me. You could say my books are crap. That's fine. That's your prerogative as a reader. No issue with that. But she said I owed my success to white privilege. Now, all right, if anybody knows me, she clearly doesn't know me or my background, and clearly hasn't read my work. Because from the first book onwards, I was mocking white privilege. I was ridiculing white privilege because I was a kid who grew up without privilege. And then I came to Singapore and I actually had an element of white privilege, to your point. because I was white. And suddenly the kid from the working class housing estate with the Cockney accent, who nobody took seriously, who dismissed everything I ever said, the second I arrived in Singapore, suddenly I was worth listening to because I was white. But rather than abuse that, rather than hang out at the Padang with SPGs and make a fortune out of it, which I could have done, there are people here who I know have done that, I made fun of it. I mocked it. I ridiculed it. I closed so many doors for myself, Wayne. You wouldn't believe it. I still say that at certain British clubs, there must be a dartboard with my face on it. So I mocked it. I ridiculed it. I pointed out the absurdity of it. So to say that, you know, it was white privilege that got the book published, even if that was true, and I will acknowledge that white privilege helped me in Singapore. I've always acknowledged it initially. That would only get me as far as the publication stage, right or not? It's not going to help me sell the book. Nobody can see the color of my skin between the lines of a page. And even if it did help me, it's not going to help me for the next 24 books. There had to be something in the book that people wanted to read that they kept coming back to. And it was that. It was the displacement. It was the fish out of water element. It was the outsider with an insider's perspective. I'm local, but I'm not local. I'm foreign, but I'm not foreign. I'm expat, but I'm not expat. I just wrote a column about it for you. You know, I fit in everywhere, but nowhere. And so you can write better books about Singapore than me. You can write more academic books about Singapore than me. You can write funnier books about Singapore than me, but you cannot write a Singaporean book like me. It's just not possible because of my unique experiences that led me to that point. Working class kids from broken homes don't generally become best-selling authors, and they certainly don't end up doing it in another country. So I bring a unique working class background to my writing, and then I end up in Toa Payoh, which not many expats end up in anyway. Many expats have never even seen Toa Payoh, right? And then, so you've got this confluence of unique events coming together at the right time. So you're right in the sense that in that specific sense, the displacement helped, you know, because it was a unique set of circumstances all coming together on the page of a book. So yeah, that certainly helps. I don't deny that. I don't deny that. Yeah, but I would have still have become a writer, but I would have wrote about something else. Obviously, I mean, my teachers were telling me from the age of 11, you know, and I've told stories about this before. 11, 15, 18. There were seminal clear moments in my life where teachers actually sat me down and said, "You could actually be a writer." At the age of 11, I was told this. And I thought, that's ridiculous. You know, people from my world don't become writers. People from my world, they don't go to bookshops unless they're buying the daily newspaper to look at page 3 and naked women. They don't generally become writers. So yeah, the displacement helped, but it wasn't a defining moment, you know?
Are there authors that you can recommend to people that help shape your worldview or help shape you as a writer?
Oh, there's so many. Well, I'll start at the beginning.
Who do you think that people should read?
This author, Sue Townsend, because I've said this many times. Her book, which I can't find on the shelf now, but her book, The Secret Diary of Adrian Mole, aged 13 3/4, is still, I believe, one of the greatest books ever written. Seminal. It's David Walliams' favorite book, you know, and he's now become a famous children's author. It's probably, if it's not my favorite book, it'll be in the top 3. And to anyone who hasn't read it, and it's never gone out of print. The book is 40 years old. Any library in Singapore today, Kinokuniya today, even some popular stores will still have the latest version of The Secret Diary of Adrian Mole, aged 13 3/4, which is extraordinary. Because when you think about it, it's a book about a kid, a working class English white kid growing up in a housing estate in a really nondescript part of England, Leicester. You know, people know it for Leicester City, but you know, the Midlands of England. It's not London, it's not Manchester, it's not Liverpool, it's not Glasgow or Edinburgh. It's Leicester. I mean, who's Leicester apart from the football team? So how does that translate? How is it so popular in Singapore and Malaysia and this and that? It's because, and it inspired, by the way, the teenage textbook, Singaporean book. It's a coming of age book. It's a rites of passage book. It's about a boy going through puberty. It really is no more or no less complicated than that. But within that story, it's talking about politics in the 1980s. It's talking about the class structure. It's talking about rich-poor divide. It's talking about the social snobbery that's so uniquely British, but translatable to other countries as well. It's talking about Thatcherism in the 80s. And this is all a book about a 13-year-old boy. And apart from that, it is without doubt one of the funniest books I've ever read. I mean, one of the hardest things to do, and one of the things that is most gratifying when people are kind enough to say it to me, is when people laugh out loud at something written on a page. Do you know how hard that is to do? It's one thing to laugh at a movie or a TV show, but to make someone laugh out loud from a word, from a sentence on a page is really hard. And really hard. I mean, if you can do it once or twice in a book, that's the gold standard. You can make someone smile, you can make someone titter, but to make someone laugh out loud, well, Sue Townsend, league of her own, league of her own. I mean, it's interesting. I see here, look, I laughed until I cried on the cover. Bill Bryson has done it to me. Sue Townsend has done it to me. Spike Milligan has done it to me. Tom Sharp did it to me when I was a teenager to make me actually laugh. Tony Parsons has done it to me. Man and Boy made me laugh out loud. And then, of course, the clincher, as I always tell people, the clincher is this 13-year-old boy was written by a middle-aged woman. And I sometimes think it had to be. I don't know why. It works on whole different levels that I'm not a psychiatrist, I don't understand. But in some ways, I don't even think a man could have written that book so incisively, so gloriously, bitingly satirical, so funny in a way that the sarcastic Sue Townsend could. So that was the book. That was the book that set off a light bulb that you can be funny. You can talk about dark issues in a funny way. Because that book talks about death, divorce, your parents having affairs. I mean, really dark stuff, but it's laugh out loud funny. So start with Sue Townsend and go from there.
Before you go, I just want to talk about, has the Singapore landscape of publishing changed since, I mean, you've been here for the longest time. Now, is it easier for anyone to become a writer or at least become a good writer?
Oh, it's interesting because it's a paradox, because on the one hand, as I always say, it's never been a better time to get published, because when I started, there were literally, it was almost so quaint. I mean, I wrote a synopsis, I wrote the first 3 chapters, I went to the yellow pages. Can you believe that? And I got the phone numbers. I mean, you couldn't do this in England. I got the direct phone numbers for the 3 publishers at the time. And they all said, yeah, come in, we'll have a meeting. That doesn't happen in England. They get like 1,000 manuscripts a week. There's like a chain of command. You have to get to the intern, then you get to the junior agent, then you get to the agent, and then you get to the you know, but it was so different then. The flip side was there wasn't that many. You know, there wasn't Epigram, there wasn't Ethos, there wasn't, no, Landmark was around, but there wasn't many. Now there's about half a dozen. There's Marshall Cavendish, there's Epigram, there's Ethos, there's Landmark, there's World Scientific, and there's so many different outlets. And now, to give some credit here, the NAC gives a lot more money now than it did when I started for books, whether it's, you know, fiction, non-fiction, poetry. There's a lot more funding available that local publishing can tap into. So they need more local content than ever before. And that's before you even get into the ebooks. There are publishers set up purely for profit. They don't deny it, but they'll say, look, if you pay us a sum, we'll publish your book as an ebook, and then you keep all the royalties, or we'll split the royalties or whatever. So you've got more opportunities to self-publish than ever before. And when you self-publish, of course, you instantly have a global platform. You put it up on Amazon, you put it up on, Audible, Apple, whatever. You have a global platform, a global bookshelf like that. Didn't exist 10 years ago. You can see I'm leading up to a but here. The but is fewer people are reading paid content than ever before. Notice I said paid content, because the irony is more people are reading now than at any time in human existence. They're reading morning, noon, and night. You go on a phone, you go on a train, everybody's reading. If they're not watching Korean dramas or Netflix, they're reading. Reading. But most of it's free content. It's newspapers, websites, whatever. But most of it's free content. But they're reading. The tough part is to get people to read your paid content. That's the dilemma that newspapers, magazines, Esquire, everybody else is having. That's the tricky part. To stay relevant, relevant. That's the only. I remember I went to the World Cup 2014 for the new paper, and I came back after the World Cup. I was there 5 weeks in Brazil. It's fantastic. And so we have this sort of post-mortem debrief chat, what did you do right? What can we do better? What should we change moving forward, And I said, I've got one word. It was my, zeitgeisty word of the moment. Relevance. My whole 5 weeks in Brazil, I was obsessed with relevance. What can I give the readers that they can't get from a million other sources that keeps me relevant? I've got to give them a reason every single day to read me. I'd like to think it was quality of writing, insight, color, humor. Yes, but I have to give them on the ground stuff. I have to give them something in the moment. I have to give them something from Rio or from the Copacabana beach, or I have to give them an interview from a cute beach volleyballer on a beach at Copacabana. I have to give them something that they can't get from 100 other places. I have to give them relevance. I have to make myself relevant. And that's the same with this. That's the same with Esquire columns. That's the same with anything I do. I have to try to stay relevant. And that is the biggest challenge for any writer today. You have more platforms than any before to get your work published, but equally, you have a greater challenge than any time before to get your voice heard above all those other platforms. And I come back to the thing we said right at the start, which is don't write like Wayne Chong, unless you're Wayne Chong. Don't write like Neil Humphreys. Don't write like Sue Townsend. Write like you, because that's the only chance, I think, you've got of being heard above the millions of other voices on hundreds of different platforms. There are thousands of writers who can write about the World Cup, who can write about lifestyle, who can write about the latest fashion trends, who can write about the latest movie, and so on and so on. There are thousands of writers doing that right now, but none of them can do it like you. And that's it. I mean, it's as simple and as complicated as that. It's simple because, yes, nobody else can write like you. It's complicated because how are you going to make your voice stand out? How are you going to make your voice unique? Is it going to be a poignant, empathetic, funny, satirical, insightful, intelligent, academic, whatever road you take, it must stand out, above the hundreds of others. So it's never been easier and it's never been more difficult. How's that for sitting on the fence?